So, on to our main topic today. We are going back to fifth edition and looking at the game in the 10 years since the release of the first public playtest packet of D&D Next. We are up to chapter 6, which is all about customization options. So let me read from the book of Player's Handbook. The combination of ability scores, race, class, and background defines your character capabilities in the game, and the personal details you create set your character apart from every other character. Even within your class and race, you have options to fine tune what your character can do. But this chapter is for players who, with the DM's permission, want to go a step further. So that is how the customization options chapter begins. And the first thing I thought of was, with the DM's permission, is the funniest thing I've ever heard. Because if you put it in the player's handbook, it is there. If
Yeah.
you put something into the main rules of the game and then say, well, it's optional or up to the game master, you are leaving the game master in an impossible position, because the game master becomes the baddie
Right.
if they have to say, no, I can't allow that. Uh, any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'd take it further that I think that the player's handbook should, instead of saying this is an option, say these this type of customization can be problematic. Here's why. Right? Here's what it can do to
Mhm.
your game.
Yeah,
Right, player. Like, speak to the player and say, don't be an ass about this, right? Like, don't add another class solely to destroy the game. Like, that's not going to be fun for you in the long run, or the rest of the players, or the DM. And it's same thing with feat choice. If you start taking feat choices solely to be optimal, well, that's gonna have an impact on the game. So think through that, right? Like, that's what I would
mhm,
rather do than to try to say this. And especially as we
right.
look at one D&D and see how D&D is really not balance wise going to allow you to not have feats. Like, that idea of taking an ability score is out the window, at least with what we're seeing currently,
Mhm.
right? It doesn't make any sense.
And yet we go back to what we've mentioned 2 or 3 times in different ways throughout this episode of this. They want to sell it to everyone. And
Yes.
one of their audience is, let me see how I can put things together to absolutely break this.
Mhm.
And I would say it's not a majority, and it's not even a large minority, but it is a very powerful minority. It is a very motivated minority. These are the people who are going to buy every book
Mhm.
because they want to get that next thing. So to call them out like that, as truthful as it is, that being the most powerful character may not be great for your game,
Mhm.
do doesn't it doesn't even register with people who, not even if they're trying to, they may not understand that making the most powerful character, how it can affect the game, because maybe they've never game mastered, or maybe they just don't care.
But I
Uh,
think something can be
so
done there
it's
to
tough.
reach to establish that, right? To establish that as a knowledge baseline.
Mm.
And and it's also how the game
I
gets
agree.
architected, right? You've got two main customization options here: multiclassing and feats. And when I think about multiclassing back when I began the game, it was literally because you're like, I want to be a rogue, but boy, I wish I could cast a spell or two as well, right? Or I want to wear
Mhm.
slightly heavier armor and bump up my armor class. But it wasn't about breaking the game. It was just sort of having that dynamic. And so you'd invest in this other class and be a little more well rounded, which you would hope would help your survival. But that wasn't necessarily true. And you were giving things up to do so. It has changed a lot since that time. Especially in third
Yeah.
edition. But
Now I'm Yeah, with the earliest editions, multi-classing was obviously, it was important because there weren't things like subclasses. There weren't
mhm,
things like backgrounds. There weren't those things that let you create a character, that you were envisioning, and it might have been a little different without, it was lacking those other methods. So multi-classing was one of the few ways you could do it. but still multiclassing didn't really add power to your character. In a lot of ways,
Right.
it took power away, right? If you were a fighter and you multiclassed into wizard, you couldn't wear armor. I'm right in that, right? You couldn't cast
I think
spells
that's the case. Yeah.
if you were wearing armor.
Right.
Unless like in later in those editions, they added ways to do it. So, you could cast spells then as a fighter, sure, but your main thing with
Yeah.
fighter is, oh, I can wear armor like the wizard can't. So multiclassing didn't bump up your power the way it does in these later editions. It sort of drained your power.
Yeah, and
But let's talk
realistically, like
about
you're
the
saying,
basics. Oh, go ahead.
some of those combinations, like a fighter wizard, just didn't work. You'd want to be an elf, which already had rules
Right.
for doing it.
Exactly.
But, but yeah, I mean, I actually like fifth edition multiclassing a fair bit, and in that it's not generally so absurdly broken. You're always going to have situations where someone takes a level of whatever to just get that thing. I mean that's going to happen, that someone's going to dip into a level or two to get whatever, the shield spell or whatever, some kind of thing like that. And I disgustingly made a character not too long ago that took a single level of sorcerer to get some kind of, I can't even remember why I did it, but for some, re-roll or thing like that, that was just more powerful than having another level of your cleric class. But in general, it's
Mhm.
not too strong. So I'm okay with it. I don't generally multi-class at all. A lot of people do, and I'm not judging you for it. But I like straight class characters. I bet I have in D&D Beyond, out of many, many, many characters, I bet I have two multi-class characters. So I would
Mhm.
not personally have an issue if it went away. I know it's not going to go away. But I do like the idea of controlling it and keeping it fairly fairly contained in terms
Mhm.
of what it's capable of doing. I think that the current rules we've seen are exactly the ones in 1D&D. So it doesn't sound like Wizards intends on changing it. Would you do something to change it?
Mhm. I doubt it.
Mhm.
Um, I don't I think that multiclassing is one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't things. Again, people want that freedom because they've had that freedom for several editions now. It's as much of the game to some people as Magic Missile and Beholders.
Yeah.
So taking it out of the game is hard, but making it balanced against the other options you have is hard as well. But let's go through some of the things that
Sure.
this
Yeah.
uh, chapter talks about and why. So the first thing it talks about is prerequisites. You must have a score of 13 or higher in the important ability scores for both classes, the one that you already have and the new class you're taking. Why? And that score is 13. Why? Because the rules have to protect players from themselves, especially new players. Because unless you are thinking far ahead, multiclassing can lead to a much weaker character than just keeping the same class
Hmm.
going forward. And remember, we've talked about this many times. The main problem with games like D&D with terms of players is not players all being of a certain type, right? It's not that the power gamers, this group of power gamers is destroying the game, or it's not this group of people who are actors are destroying the game.
Right.
It's when you get three power gamers and three actors sitting down at the same table, both wanting different things from the game
Yeah.
and making the play sort of incompatible. So that's why we have these prerequisites, because they don't want someone who's super optimized and then somebody who's like, "Oh, I want to be a fighter rogue thief or fighter rogue druid sorcerer paladin and none of my things work together and I'm pretty
Yeah.
useless in the long run power wise." We don't want them playing at the same table. So this prerequisite sort of make sure you at least have a +1 in the abilities that you are going to be using regularly as that character.
Yeah. I
Does that
mean,
make sense?
yeah, it does, and it's interesting the choice of 13. I think it reflects where sort of the points spreads work these days, because in older editions this probably would have been a little higher. Um, 13 is pretty easy to hit, sort of, even if it's an ability you're not going to use a whole lot, but it is telling you that, hey, you'll have to focus on certain features and not others if you go down this route.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Next, they talk about experience points, saying that you can gain a level via experience points based on your total character level rather than just on the one class. So, to go from a level 1 rogue to a level 2 rogue, you would need 300 experience points. However, if you are a 10th level fighter and a first level rogue, you would need the full 15,000 experience points, since you're actually going from 11 to
Mhm.
12. And that may seem to people who have only played 5th edition or recent editions seem strange to have to point out. But before that wasn't the case.
Right.
Before, if you were a 12th level wizard and a first level rogue, to get to second level, you would only need the number of experience points to get to a second level of rogue.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so that that's important to note, that people who are holdovers from previous editions might need to understand that.
Yeah, and what it really means is, if you're going to cap out at level 20 with your party, you will at the end not be, level 20 rogue, level 20 fighter. You'll be a total of 20 levels, and the rest of your party will also be a
Yep.
total of 20 levels. You're not going to make that up in some weird way. And AD&D was full of not only different experience point costs per level per class, so a wizard was different than a fighter, but
Mhm.
also different at different levels. And so, yeah, you'd do these weird things where you'd have a total number of levels if you're multi-class that was way higher than what the person next to you had. And in fact, you could end up with just, yeah, total different levels, what everybody was, because the costs were all different.
Right.
It was a mess. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Next, it talks about hit points and hit dice. When you multi-class, you gain the hit die type of your new class, which might be different from your old classes. This is important to clarify for a couple of different reasons. As we see new mechanics being introduced that use hit dice in different ways,
Hmm.
you might be able to spend the D12 for being the barbarian as opposed to spending the D6 for being the wizard.
Yeah.
Uh, and that may come in handy. In fact, there is no rule that I'm aware of that explains which hit dice you recover when you take a long rest in 5th edition. So
No.
if you're a barbarian 4, wizard 2, um, and you use all your hit dice, you take a long rest, you're only supposed to get back half your hit dice. Can you just say, well, I'm going to get back all 3 of my barbarian hit dice and ignore the lower D6 hit dice? I don't know.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, it doesn't say. So I guess you'd get to choose.
Mhm. And your what talks about proficiency bonus. Your proficiency bonus is always determined by the character level, not by the individual class levels. And I've mentioned this before, but this is a concern I have about tying things with proficiency bonus, because if you get class or subclass abilities that you can use a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus, and you end up able to use each of those 5 times at high levels, um,
Yeah.
especially if a new edition of the game gets rid of the action economy. The action economy sort of keeps that within reason, because you still need to spend an action or a bonus action or a reaction to do the thing. So you can't do 12 things on the same turn. If we start adding things like no actions or swift actions, or more, you get 2 bonus actions instead of just 1, then that sort of imbalance could come into play a little bit more.
And especially anything that you can do every single round, right? Something that a feat is letting you do all the time. And if it's tied to proficiency bonus, those are things to look at. And Wizards sometimes forgets, when we have silvery barbs, like we see things that, wow, you can't believe it made it through. And so um,
Mhm,
it is a worry when so many things are going off of proficiency bonus that then this can be something that gets exploited.
mhm. And the one thing I didn't put in the show notes, but is always important to see, are things you get from a class
Mm.
that sort of either overlap or are adjacent to um, abilities in your new class. So you start as a wizard, so you have spell slots and you have known spells and learn spells and so on. And then you take a ranger level and become a spellcaster that uses the ranger's sort of limited spell progression. How do those things work with each other?
Yeah.
This is something that, since I rarely play spellcasters and rarely multiclass, I just ignore.
Well, and it may
Could you explain to me
change.
how it works, Teos?
Well, so when you have it, so a lot of it is whether your class gives you spell slots or whether you're memorizing, preparing spells, and that who knows what's going to happen because so far everything we're seeing seems to suggest that classes are moving to spell slots. So in the future, this may really be intermixed, but you basically get to add your spell slots together, which is one of the reasons why it's can be very powerful to dip into other classes and pick up spell slots that you can then use for the thing you want to spam all the time or those kinds of situations. Um, so in general, you're adding together your levels and all these various spell slot classes to get more spell slots out of that. Paladin and Ranger classes, you
Mhm.
have those levels, and then third or fighter levels are rounded down if you have a spell casting feature. Third of those, and you round down.
Okay.
So it's complicated, is the answer, and I think more complicated than people necessarily want it to be to do by hand, but still quite powerful, right? It's quite powerful to get these. A lot of times, what people are looking for when they're doing these kinds of dips is just a couple of uses of something because that alone is substantial, right? If I get silvery barbs a couple of times a day and a cool class feature, that's can be more powerful than taking another level in my class, right?
Mhm. So, for example, if you're a cleric of 15th level and you take one level of wizard, you can cast with your cleric's spell slot of high level that first level wizard spell that you just learned, correct?
In this case, that's you're mixing sort of prepared spells and not. But an easier example is if you did like a sorcerer and a cleric, then you would be as if you were that
Okay.
combined levels in spell slots.
Okay. So I
Yeah,
could cast a sixth level version of a first level spell, even though I'm only first level in that class
yeah.
that the spell comes from.
Yeah, and we get the
Okay.
table given to us so we can kind of add up those total there. But yeah, it is pretty interesting. And so what ends up being the downside to multicast classing as a primary spellcaster is that you are giving up um, your class um, progression being faster if you take non or your spell ability if you take uh, non spell slot classes. It's complicated to say. Yeah. I
All
think
right.
that's. I think in
So
general, I think
just
this is
one of the
yeah
joys of multiclassing.
one of the joys. It is generally fine. It'll be interesting to see. This may change and get a little simpler if we're getting rid of prepared spells, which it might be what's happening.
The second thing that we get in this chapter are feats. And we've talked about feats ad nauseum, I feel like,
Yeah, yeah,
because of how powerful they are and how optional they seem to be in fifth edition, but aren't.
yeah.
So, this is what the chapter says. A feat represents a talent or an area of expertise that gives a character special abilities. It embodies training, experience, and abilities beyond what a class provides. Talk to me.
Well, yeah. I don't think we need to go in any great detail, but I think that what's happening here is is that fifth edition itself at the 2014 level isn't exactly sure what it wants to do. It wants to achieve this thing to show this talent or area of expertise. It wants to let you expand upon a facet of your character. But as we heard back when fifth edition was being released, the goal was hey, these feats are going to feel like a package like a set of things that sort of tell a story. So they're meaty and they're supposed to do a lot for you. And sometimes when you look at it like athlete, actor, you know, dungeon delver, that seems very true, right? Like you can see how they're going for that. I'm a healer. But you also have feats like lucky and things that are, great weapon master where it's just clearly power. And so I think it loses itself and they aren't all this sort of big package that tells a story. and I think are becoming even less so about that with what we see in 1D and D. And I think that the game really is fighting itself, trying to decide whether it wants to be more like third edition, where you took a bunch of little things and it was sort of candy you're getting periodically to define yourself, and that also makes it fun to character build, or whether you're trying to tell this larger narrative story and it's less about power and more about, a number of different features you dip into in different opportunities. Um, a lot of feats
Mhm.
also provide things that are a little more exploratory in nature or role playing, so they're hitting on the other pillars of play versus combat. It'll be interesting to see whether that waters down further, because I think it's easy to want to make these choices be all combat pillar related, which is a danger to the game. So if this were me,
Mhm.
if I were re-envisioning fifth edition, I think I would want fewer feats that are meatier packages. I like that as a concept, and I would want to make them more interesting and less combat heavy.
Mhm.
That'd be my goal.
More interesting, less combat heavy. And right now they are in 5th edition, they are used instead of an ability score increase,
Right.
which is the thing that's supposed to balance out.
Right.
If you wanted to balance them, you could say this feat needs to be equal to a +1 and an ability that the character would have, presumably one that's important to them, that will add 1 to their armor class, that will add 1 to their attack bonus and damage, that will add 1 to their
Yeah.
spell save DC, etc., etc. And if a feat doesn't do that, either underpowered or overpowered, then you are falling back into that trap of people sitting down at the table are going to have much more overpowered or much more underpowered characters than each other, which throws out the balance at the table.
Amen. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
So, otherwise, you can go back and listen to all the other episodes where we talk about feats, either in 5th edition or in any of the books that have added
Yeah.
feats recently, uh, or our look at one D&D's feats, where we talk about it in great detail as well.
Yeah.
Anything else about chapter 6, Teos?
No, it's an interesting chapter and one that may be, yeah, changing substantially in the future. We'll see.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Teos, for sharing your radiance with us yet again. And thank you to our patrons who have done us the great service of allowing us to keep bringing this show to you as an independent entity. Thank you to our Master of Dungeon supporters, and a special shout out to our Master of Realms who are listed in our show notes, and a shout out to our Master of the Multiverse backers, Craig Bailey, John Carney, Darren Chandler, Robin Derme, Andy Edmonds at nerdrenomicon.com, Ben F., Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Brian King, Eric Mengi, Nain Akra. Is that how you pronounce that?
I
It
think that
is
sounds
now.
good.
Falcon Neal, Krishna Simonse, David Somerville at the Planagea RPG setting, Joe Tyler, and Graham Ward.
Thank
And
you.
thank you too to all of our listeners. Yes. If you would like to become a patron of the show, please consider supporting our Patreon at patreon.com/masteringdnd. Teos, where can people find you on the interwebs?
Find me at alphastream.org. I'm on Twitter at alphastream and all those other social media things everybody's trying out. I'm somewhere out there with the same alphastream, but not really checking anything. How about you, Shawn?
Mhm. Until Twitter implodes completely, I am on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, and the podcast is on Twitter at MasteringDND. Uh, you can join our community and ask questions on Patreon. You can also watch our show on our new Mastering Dungeons YouTube channel, where you can leave comments, questions, suggestions, and the like. So, Teos, we're done. We're done with chapter 6. What are we going to do now?
We're gonna fight chapter 7 with all of our optional feats that make us super, super beefy.
Mm. I am known, as a flour monger. That's my feat,
Super, super beefy is what I'm having for lunch.
and I'm not talking about I'm talking about the stuff you make bread with.
Oh, that kind of flour. Yeah.
Mm. There's a joke there somewhere, but I've lost it.